Hello, everyone, and welcome to an episode of the Dairy Signal. We're excited to either have you back for a repeat listener, or if you're listening in and tuning in for the very first time, thank you for discovering the Dairy Signal. It's a great chance to lean into forward thought, forward-leaning questions and topics. We bring you experts from not only your backyard, regardless of where you are, but also internationally and the scope of what's going on. So thank you for tuning in. We definitely value in your input and your valued listening. With that being said, it's made possible by our national sponsors. So these are folks that not only align with PDPW or professional dairy producers, but truly they walk and want to support fellow dairymen. Again, regardless of where you're at, if you're on the East Coast, West Coast, or sandwiched right there in the middle, they walk there and want to be there, part of your support system throughout. So again, a special thank you to our national partners that make not only the Dairy Signal, but a lot of what we do throughout our calendar year possible. So a true thank you for that. And now, without further ado, and probably the true reason why you're listening and tuning in today is to hear from a dear friend of ours, Patrick Wood, who, without further ado, is joining us from the East Coast. Again, Patrick, thank you for joining us, tuning in on this topic of as we delve into the carbon markets, the carbon discussion, sustainability. It's a beast. And as we continue to break it down, understand it a little bit further, and respect that it's continuing to change. So thank you for being a trusted resource and just valuing a lot of the insights and the information that you bring forward. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you. But again, Patrick Wood, he's the founder and the general manager of Ag Methane and Advisors, and he is located out in Vermont, but you've got a lot of projects, not only in your backyard, but across the country. So I'll let you take it over and tell us more.
Great. Thanks, Cassie. It's really nice to be here. All right. So today I'm going to be explaining how carbon markets work at a high level to start, and setting the stage and giving some context to some of the language and the types of programs and the types of opportunities that exist, and then going into the detail a little bit on the four different main categories of opportunities to explain how important questions for producers to consider as they think about pursuing one or the other of the opportunities. Sorry, my keyboard stopped working, but I can use this. So first, just a little bit of background about Ag Methane. We are a small consulting firm based here in Vermont with more than 20 years of experience helping farms across the country create various types of carbon credits. Our mission is to support farmers in improving their environmental performance, both greenhouse gas wise and other sustainability metrics. And our vision is that dairies of all sizes are able to choose from a range of carbon and ecosystem service market opportunities to access incentives to improve their environmental performance. We want to make sure that dairies are well informed and fairly compensated so they can make decisions that work well for them. And our perspective is that climate change is real. It's happening now. It's not going away. Both businesses and society need to adapt to avoid the worst effects of it, which will be much more costly than not adapting. And that the businesses that do adapt and figure out how to adjust their operations will have the best outcomes and competitive advantage in the long term. So most of our experience is working with manure management and specifically anaerobic digestion projects. But we're also deeply involved in enteric methane projects. Enteric methane is the methane that's produced in the rumen, and cows generally burp most of it out. And then also deeply involved in alternative manure management projects. So those are non-digester ways to avoid manure methane. And we're also involved in the various types of cropping projects. Some are related to nitrogen management to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. Others are related to soil carbon storage. So these are the move this over there a little bit. The focus today is going to be talking through these 4 examples of different carbon project types. I just mentioned them there, but digesters, alternative manure management, otherwise known as AMP, I may refer to enteric methane, and then the regenerative agriculture, or the various ways of uh, of cropping. I'm not going to get too far into specific dollar values that a producer might receive in each of them, because there's really too many variables, structures. The markets are different. The prices in different markets are different, and different business arrangements. I'll touch on some of that a little bit, but not too much. And I apologize for this last bullet. That's left from the business conference, and I'm not going to be doing another session tomorrow. So a lot of folks may have heard about carbon offsets, and that was the first type of environmental commodity that was relevant to dairies in carbon markets, and still is relevant to a lot of dairies, still is a viable opportunity in a lot of situations. But also there's a trend happening away from offsets and toward what are called insets. And an offset and an inset are both equivalent to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reductions. And they are really the word off versus the word in really has to do with whether the emissions reductions are claimed within a supply chain or not. So are the emissions reductions claimed by global chocolate company is an example I use a lot, that relies on milk from a dairy farm to produce their chocolate. That might be, if it's in their supply chain, it's generally called an inset. And there's lots of important distinctions. I'll talk on some of them, but an offset is more likely to be sold outside of a dairy supply chain, like maybe sold to an airline or something like that. This trend away from offsets towards insets is several years in the making, largely driven by a criticism of offsets not having enough integrity and climate policy shifting towards more structural emissions reductions that are going to last over the long term. And I'll explain more about why this is. But a couple, just want to.
So Patrick, one clarifying thing, when you're talking about questioning like inset integrity, is that how it's being calculated, or where's the question coming into play?
So, first, let me just say there's a couple different names for insets, and this gets toward the answer to your question. They are also called scope 3 interventions, supply chain interventions. And what has happened with a lot of offsets historically, well, first, there have been bunk offsets created, and several years ago, there was lots of criticism of specific projects, mostly targeted on forest carbon offsets. And this is things like an entire John Oliver show being devoted to criticisms of offsets, and articles in the New Yorker and the Guardian and things like that. So, but the whole offset industry received criticism as part of this, largely because if somebody just always buys offsets to reduce their emissions, but doesn't actually change their business operations, then they're mitigating their emissions to some degree, but not enough to really adapt to climate change over the long term. We need what's typically referred to as structural decarbonization, where companies' operations are changing, so they're not just always paying somebody else for the right to claim emissions reductions, but they're actually reducing their own emissions. So when a big cheese producer, big chocolate producer, somebody like that is working with their farm suppliers to provide incentives to the farms to reduce emissions, then you have more permanent emissions reductions.
Mhm.
Um, and or you can, permanent is also a term of art. I'm not using it that way here, but emissions reductions that will perpetuate into the future, um, which has more integrity as we are trying to achieve net zero goals.
So am I oversimplifying the statement if I say that more of the criticism was coming in the landscape or in the discussion of the offset versus the inset is being right now it's relatively well received?
Insets are an improvement over offsets to the integrity issues. They are part of the solution to the integrity concerns of offsets.
Okay.
Insets as a category of environmental credit have much more integrity than offsets. They still have to be produced the right way, following global standards. The accounting has to be done well. They have to be real, scientifically defensible, all those things. But as a market mechanism, they have much more integrity than offsets do.
Okay. So as far as a moving target, it's going theoretically in the right direction.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
That being said, is it going in the from a climate policy perspective, it's absolutely going in the right direction. A different question is it going in the right direction for dairy producers? Hopefully it is. And generally, I think the answer is yes, it is, because it will likely open up more opportunities for farms to participate in these markets. There will likely be barriers to entry will be reduced. That being said, there are concerns from a lot of producers that um, the accounting and additional focus on emissions reductions may ultimately lead to mandates for farms to reduce their emissions without the ability to receive financial incentives from things like insets. And if it ends up being mandates that have additional costs, not leading to net profit, even if those additional costs lead to efficiencies on the farm and cost savings and things like that. I think that's a big question that producers need to be aware of, and we try and advocate for. So to get a little more specific here, this is both a pie chart and bar chart from a study done in 2013, commissioned by DMI to determine the average carbon footprint of U.S. milk. And the most significant points I want to get across here today are that about 75% of the carbon footprint of milk is associated with the farm. So there's a lot of transportation involved in getting milk from the farm to a consumer at home. There's a lot of emissions associated with processing and refrigeration and all those things. But compared to the emissions on the farm, those are relatively small portions. And the biggest sources of emissions here the biggest source of emissions is from methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's about 85 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year time horizon. And there are ways to reduce this, and that when farms probably won't be able to eliminate all of that methane, but when they do reduce their methane emissions, they can create value and assets to be monetized in carbon markets. So nitrous oxide, nitrous oxide here is also significant. Nitrous oxide is associated with nitrogen, and nitrous oxide is about 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. It is more difficult to reduce, largely because the nitrogen cycle is more complicated and dynamic. But there are options for reducing nitrous oxide emissions as well. And when carbon dioxide is shown here associated with producing feed, when that largely that has to do with tillage of soil and use of fossil fuel. But when carbon dioxide can be stored in the soil through no-till and other regenerative ag practices, cover cropping, and a variety of other things, you can create a carbon sink, which helps reduce the carbon footprint as well. So, let's see, I'm actually going to skip to the next slide for a second. And a lot of and I'll come back to that previous one, a lot of the push towards insets and this improvement in integrity in carbon markets, and the reason that insets have more integrity has to do with what are called net zero standards. And it's important to keep in mind that all of this accounting that goes on, greenhouse gas accounting, is not just willy-nilly. There are global standards for how to do this, and the greenhouse gas protocol is the leading global standard. It's equivalent to generally accepted accounting practices for financial accounting. And some of the critical questions in the accounting are making sure that the accounting is real and scientifically defensible, that emissions reductions are permanent and can't be reversed. So, for example, if you store carbon in, if you're doing no-till for a while and cover cropping and you're building up your soil carbon, and then you 3 years later till that soil, that carbon is released again. So that would be impermanent. And there's ways to manage things like that, which are called reversals. And that there's good auditing happening so that there is the accounting has integrity. In addition, there are, over the past several years, growth and more focus on net zero standards. Net zero means that an entity's emissions, whether that's a farm, company, a country, are no longer increasing as of a given point in time. Typically, those goals are the global climate scientists recommend that societally we achieve net zero by 2050. But companies are generally setting targets to be net zero by 2045. That doesn't mean their emissions are going to be totally eliminated. It just means they will no longer be increasing. And so the Science-Based Targets Initiative is the leading global net zero standard. There's a lot of overlap. Science-Based Targets Initiative is referred to as SBTI. There's a lot of overlap between the SBTI standards and the GHG protocol standards. And there's more than 10,000 companies globally are participating in SBTI, with I've listed several big names in the dairy industry here who are participating. And significant to note that offsets currently are not allowed for SBTI compliance. And SBTI's flushing out some additional guidance and may make some changes. They're probably not going to let offsets be allowed, but they are allowing more flexibility for the use of insets. And all of this accounting is done on the basis of this term here, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And I'm going to skip back to the previous slide to explain what that means. So, because this is very relevant for understanding the relationship and business relationship between farms and their milk processors and the ultimate end users like the global chocolate company. So, scope 1 emissions are all the emissions within a company's direct control. So, for a farm, that would be the feed they grow themselves, the animal husbandry, the manure management on the farm. combustion of fuel in vehicles that they own or stationary sources on the farm. For let's say a milk company, a processor, a co-op, that would be combusting fuel in vehicles they own, or on-site wastewater treatment they have, as an example. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions associated with purchased energy, typically purchased electricity. So depending on producing electricity from coal or natural gas has a lot more emissions than producing electricity in a digester or solar or wind. And so the electric grids have a different mix. The grid mix has a different carbon footprint, and that leads to the scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are everything in an entity's supply chain. So for a farm who buys in fertilizer, the emissions associated with that fertilizer are the farm's scope 3. The purchased feed that the farm purchases doesn't grow themselves would be the farm's scope 3. Whereas the emissions from the farm are scope 3 for the co-op processor. And in turn, the co-op processor's emissions and the farms are all scope 3 for the global CPG firm. So that's why if, let's take Nestle as an example, who I've been told is the world's largest buyer of milk. They have a very public net zero commitment. The board of Nestle, their compensation is partially associated with meeting Nestle's interim targets towards their net zero commitment. So they know that in order to meet those goals, they have to work with their suppliers, co-ops and processors, and therefore the farms in order to reduce emissions, because the farms make up such a big portion of the emissions that they need to reduce. Here, I mostly want to mention that these global standards then get implemented by different organizations, typically referred to as registries. So these are the names of several of the leading registries out there. Vera is the world's largest. SustainCert is another one that's largely focused on scope 3 emissions. The Climate Action Reserve is mostly focused on offsets, and I think they're missing the boat a little bit, getting behind on insets, even though they've done a lot related to agriculture. And Vera and SustainCert are working closely together on improving infrastructure for scope 3 accounting and reporting in order to help companies produce more insets. So it's going to be interesting to see how that relationship evolves. So now getting into where is the economic value in all of this? And this is an image taken from SBTI from their website back in January, and showing the number of companies around the world that are participating in this. And just to do the reporting and accounting to meet their SBTI commitments takes a lot of time. And there's value to the corporations in meeting those goals, and there's also a cost in meeting those goals. So that's fundamentally where the economic value comes from, but that can manifest in several different ways. So first is, as they've voluntarily made these commitments, or some of them have internal prices of carbon that they make business decisions based on, there's value there. Second is they have regulatory commitments, and I'll explain more about this, but there are more and more carbon, climate risk, and disclosure regulations coming out in different jurisdictions around the world. And so meeting those regulatory obligations has a cost to them, and therefore there can be value there for farms. Then you have actually creating credits, insets and offsets and other types of credits. In addition, in order to do the reporting to meet the net zero goals, lots of companies ultimately take lots of very detailed data on the number of cows and how the cows are fed and manure management and how crops are grown, and aggregate that into emissions factors to say something like the carbon intensity of a gallon of milk from this region of the country is X. And so that data leading to those emissions factors have a lot of value. And just important to mention here in general that as we get more and more into a world where data is aggregated and valued, the data that farms have and generate through herd management software and otherwise has value, and farms encourage farms to be careful about who's using that data, how that impacts their privacy, how that impacts business decisions, and also trying to get value from that as best they can. So speaking to some of these climate disclosure regulations, these are a couple different jurisdictions that have passed some of these rules. And in the US, the Securities Exchange Commission had a rulemaking for disclosure of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. That's currently on hold under the Trump administration. The future of that remains to be seen. But in the EU, there's this called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it applies to the entire value chain, including Scope 3 emissions. Similarly, in Canada, where it's being implemented voluntarily to start, but later phases will be mandatory for Canadian companies. And then California, which is the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world, also has their own mandates that apply to Scope 3 emissions. And to connect the dots here a little bit, regardless of what's happening at the federal level in the US, the fact that global companies in Europe and California are obligated to respond to these regulations there impacts their supply chains, which are often global, and therefore impacts farmers across the US and impacts dairy producers across the US. So even if you are in Wisconsin or Idaho or Vermont, someplace where there is not directly a greenhouse gas reporting regulation on you, the farm, the fact that there is on the Nestle's of the world and others in Europe and California and Canada means that they are more and more embedding the greenhouse gas accounting in their business decisions and in their relationships with the farms to meet their voluntary goals related to net zero commitments, but also to meet their compliance goals or compliance obligations. And this over here shows just a range of the different types of businesses that are under the jurisdiction of these regulations. So that's fast food restaurants, co-ops, processors, but it's also, this is significant here. Next slide touches on this as well, but financial institutions, investment banks, pension funds, insurance funds are responsible for the emissions associated with the investments they make. And so because one, they're obligated under these compliance regulations. Two, they know that the costs of not reducing emissions are going to be greater than the costs of adapting now over the long run. Many of them are trying to get the entities in their investment portfolios to adapt and respond, which ultimately leads to incentives and possibly mandates for farm producers down the line. So I'm just about to get into the section talking about examples for different producers. But before I do that, on the 4 different project types I mentioned earlier, before I do that, I want to talk briefly about what sustainability claims are. I mentioned that term earlier, but these are just a couple examples, and I actually kind of like Chat GPT's definition because some of the other standards out there didn't really have one. Um, and But it's basically if one entity is saying our emissions are X and we took action to reduce them and now they are Y, we are claiming that our carbon footprint is Y and we are taking responsibility for it. When they do that, the degree to which they take responsibility for it can impact the ability to generate value from it, to monetize them as credits. It also impacts who has the reporting obligation under a net zero standard or under a climate disclosure risk mandate to the EU or the state of California. So the claims that an entity can make, whether that entity is a farm or a co-op or a CPG firm, impact value. They also impact liability, and farms need to be careful not to make claims to more than one entity at a time. There's concerns about double counting, and I'll talk more about that. But farms should just be careful about the claims that they are making and the claims they want to be aware of the claims that other people are making based on their operations. And there are claims, there can be a couple different types of claims, generally referred to as absolute claims versus intensity claims. But an absolute claim would be like saying, as a result of installing a digester, we reduced emissions by 20,000 tons a year. That would be an absolute claim. It's a little different than this example I stated down here, but an intensity claim is based on reductions per unit of product. So that's when people talk about the carbon intensity. So the carbon intensity of 100 weight of milk, we improved our carbon intensity 10%, as an example. That's a different type of claim. And whether both types of claims can be made at the same time and how different entities are making them is quite nuanced and complicated, and important for producers and everybody involved in this to be aware of and careful with.
So off that note, to put it into kind of context, especially for those that are just tuning in and listening audio wise,
Yep.
I've seen reports, or actually our farm did a report, and because we're switching into compost.
Yep.
I mean, that had an environmental reduction and things like that. But then in the tailspin of it, it also, if you think of it in kind of like the layman's or the consumer context, it also took that many trucks off the road throughout the year. So it was kind of like a linking. So it's not like you were double dipping, but it's the fact that domino effect that kept going down the road, that because we switched this one model, the trickle down effect also implicated on several other factors too.
Yes.
That's not double dipping then. That's just continuing the story, correct?
No, that's one intervention. Having one intervention being switching to composting, I think is what you're saying.
Sure.
By switching to composting, as compared to putting all the manure in a slurry pit, something like that, you create methane reductions. Because composting is aerobic decomposition, which doesn't lead to methane production. You also probably have benefits in cropping because that compost is super valuable nutrient wise and great for the soil. And so there'd be emissions reductions there. And then also you are reducing trucking. So those are just 3 different sources of emissions from one intervention. So that is definitely not double counting.
Okay.
What could be double counting is if there are carbon offset projects for composting.
Mhm.
If a farm switched to composting, or they did something like Biofiltro is a company that does vermicomposting,
Mhm.
and uh, creates carbon offsets and I believe insets as well, or producers can create them if they're using that system. Somebody who is doing that, if they sold that credit, if they sold the rights and the claims to the benefits of the composting to somebody to get to create a credit and they got paid for that, typically the contract to create those credits is going to give exclusive right to whoever's buying the credit to make those claims. If at the same time the farm that's involved in this is if their co-op or processor is compensating the farm for having a lower carbon footprint, lower carbon intensity, and that co-op or processor is therefore claiming, as a result of this new activity, composting, the farm's emissions were reduced by X%,
Mhm.
and they are passing that claim then on to a global CPG firm who's using it for SBTI compliance. Then there would be double counting. And the farm is kind of in the middle here, and it can create legal risk, reputational risk for everybody involved. And especially if the farm is being compensated by two different people, or two different entities, that's where things can get sticky.
Thank you.
Yep. So switching to shifting tax here a little bit to make this a little more specific to producers. In general, my goal is to put producers in the driver's seat, help them compare apples to apples, and make good informed decisions before they dive in, because the first opportunity that comes to you isn't always the best. And for many, if not most producers, it's going to seem obvious, likely, to work with their co-op or processor because that relationship already exists, and likely want to strengthen that relationship. That said, if what the co-op or processor is offering, one, lots of co-ops and processors don't have programs available yet, and or may or may not in the future, or what they're offering may not be very appealing for one reason or another. And if that's the case, then what can a producer or a group of producers do? There are groups of farms can work together to create scale that there's economies of scale in carbon markets, just like in most other businesses, and obviously dairy farm. And so working together can help get over several different barriers. In addition, I've heard from CPG firms that they really value when interventions, they don't want to necessarily bring a top-down solution because producers might be inherently skeptical of that, and the solution that they've come up with may not work for everybody in their supply chain. And so they value when producers can develop interventions that really work for them, that are really integrated into the farm operations day to day as a whole. They're likely to just have a better fit, and the farm's likely to have a more long-term investment and therefore be more successful in the long term. And generally, I'd say farms are often familiar with various value-added businesses, and so these are just some basic sort of business planning questions. My pen here. What are your goals? What will be required of you? Do you have time, capacity, interest in doing this new thing? How will it impact your current operations? what's it going to cost you? What do you stand to make, both in terms of new revenue sources, hopefully, along with cost savings through efficiencies or otherwise. If you're switching to composting and you're not trucking as much, there's a cost savings there, both in fuel and people time. So you want to make sure that these that the trade-offs work for you. When you're doing this, it's important to be able to evaluate the insetting programs or offset program, obviously, if you're getting into that. But lots of these, there are lots of insetting Scope 3 programs being developed. Some of them have been in the works for several years, but there's still lots of details being worked out, and this is very much an evolving space. And so, as in all things in life, everything changes. And so you want to know where you're starting, but also where things are going. So, certain feed additives, as an example, let's take Bovaer as the common one, 3-NOP, that's been used in Europe for a bunch of years and used in South America for a bunch of years. And just last year started being used in the US after getting FDA approval, and went through many years of vetting in science. I'm not the animal nutritionist, but I've seen studies that are questioning its impacts on productivity. In addition, I know that due to, and this is very unfortunate, but due to conspiracy theorists in the EU thinking that use of Bovaer is going to impact human health, there's been pushback on use of Bovaer in the EU, which is incredibly unfortunate. But I've even heard about farms in the US being asked to, I've talked to farms, clients in the US who've been asked by their supply chain partners not to use Bovaer because the supply chain partners are concerned about those conspiracy theories coming here too. So those are all sorts of questions you want to ask and find out about before you commit to using something new. In addition, what are the compensation structures? Let's just stick with the feed additive example. Are you going to have to buy this product? And if so, are you going to get a production benefit that makes it worthwhile for you to buy this new product? Or are you going to get carbon market value? And how's all that going to work? For a feed additive intervention, you are probably not going to have to go out and sell the carbon offsets on your own, or carbon insets, or whichever commodity it is, on your own in the marketplace. But if you did that, I would advise a producer against that, because they just probably wouldn't have enough volume to make it worthwhile. So yeah, let me keep going here into some of the other examples. And this is really to say there are a lot of steps involved in developing a new administrative carbon project to create credits from one intervention or another. And it's usually a multi-year process that involves getting approvals from registries, going through auditing, collecting a lot of data, all after the science has to first be established. And so this is not often something that an individual farm wants to take on themselves. Better to work in a larger group, maybe even part of an aggregated carbon project where could be hundreds, if not thousands, of farms are participating. That being said, when you participate in a program like that, there's going to be less flexibility for individual farms. So this is more on evaluating insetting programs. What's the history track record of the program? Is it brand new? Has it been around for a while? What protocol standard are they going to use? What's the track record of it? There's definitely protocols that have been through a multi-year process of getting developed, rolled out into the world, and nobody uses them because they're often too complicated or too costly. And so who's going to own the credits? And how will they be sold? What is the length of the term? Is this something you get to just, you're committing to do for a year or even a month to try, or are they asking you for a longer term commitment? And typically the longer term commitments, like 20 years, is going to be for a big RNG project or something like that, where somebody has to make a big investment in equipment to be located on the farm. And then basic human issues. What's the fit with these partners you're going to be working with? Do they seem like they're going to be reliable and trustworthy? And who do you go talk to when you have issues? So this talks about the range of financial structures that exist. Some of these programs, they generate carbon credits and sell them, but also some of the smaller processors who also work with smaller farms typically recognize the economies of scale, and they may be focused not on generating carbon credit value, but on helping farms apply for grants to install a solid separator at a farm, which can lead to make that farm able to compost more of their manure. That can achieve efficiencies for the farms and cost savings and reduce emissions and be great all around, even if there is not a specific specific payment from a commodity involved. Then there's also premiums on the sale of milk, and I've seen different processors around the country have different tiers where they will offer an extra 10 or 20 cents per hundredweight based on the amount of emissions reductions or the carbon intensity of the milk from that farm. This is one point I want to make here about supply chains versus supply sheds. Often I've heard from many producers that they feel beholden to their processor or co-op, and it's obviously not easy to change. And they need to do things in line with their processor or co-op, and they don't want to rock the boat. That may seem like it limits options in terms of implementing different interventions, which very well may be the case. But also from the perspective of a global CPG or co-op or processor, they can't always know exactly which farms are providing milk all the way through to the CPG. The co-op processor knows where the milk's coming from, but then that milk may get sold once processed to 40, I don't know how many different entities. So that makes it difficult for them to do the accounting from specific farms. And one solution is that the scope 3 accounting can be based on supply sheds. So determining the carbon footprint of milk from a certain region of the country and knowing that they buy milk from that region may be sufficient for some CPGs to offer incentives. That can create flexibility for everybody involved, so that while the accounting needs to be rigorous and scientifically defensible and have all this integrity, if it's too complicated, nobody's going to be able to do it. And if it's too burdensome, it won't get done, which prevents the adaptation that we need. All right, so to go a little bit more into examples here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the digester RNG example, and then alternative manure management project example, and then enteric methane, and hopefully a little time for cropping. Some of the themes here overlap in all of these. Most of the digester RNG market is driven by compliance carbon, is part of the compliance carbon market and driven by regulations like California's low carbon fuel standard, that's the CARB LCFS up there, or the EPA renewable fuel standard. And the markets are created by regulations, and there is a voluntary RNG market that exists and is growing. But because these compliance markets are designed to reduce emissions, mostly for associated with transportation fuels, the farms that are participating are often selling the rights or claims to the emissions reductions outside of the dairy supply chain. And that can bring up this double counting question for them. It also creates a situation where their milk may not seem as valuable to a CPG who needs the lowest carbon footprint milk they can get. Because if a farm has sold the rights to emissions reductions to somebody in the energy industry, and their dairy supply chain partners can't also claim them due to double counting issues, well, then the dairy supply chain partners can only claim part of the emissions reductions associated with enteric methane or cropping, but not the manure methane reductions. So I'm hopeful that over time we will see convergence of market prices and more demand for RNG and renewable energy from dairies, demand for it by dairy supply chain partners. Then they could purchase the energy and the environmental attributes from farms, and there could be good alignment in that market. In recent years, the value in the compliance markets has been too high to make it worthwhile for most entities in the dairy supply chain to want to buy that energy. So that's just a general overarching consideration. In terms of actually installing the digester on your farm, the capital costs are very high. It's typically going to be something that most farms aren't going to want to do themselves. It takes a lot of human resources to operate them well. And so in recent past 7-8 years, there have been many more third-party digester operators, RNG developers who will own and operate the facilities on farms. But before they commit $20-30 million, they need a long time frame, like typically 20 years, to get their return on investment. So it's like getting married, in some respects, to a project developer who's likely going to lease some space on your farm, may want to buy a small piece of land close, right in the middle of your farm, in order to locate their facility. And that brings up a lot of questions that need to be carefully sorted through. I've pretty much talked about this already, but farms who are selling or participating in these compliance RNG markets need to be very careful about double counting, so that they don't run into contractual issues with their RNG partner if their CPG firm, if their dairy supply chain partners end up making claims associated with the emissions reductions also. There are opportunities for co-claiming that's really nuanced, and involves the alignment of claims. But so I'm not going to get too far into that now, but in general, just recommend producers be very careful. I'm going to skip past some of this a little bit here and talk about AMP projects. These are typically going to be, or these are the other project types. I'm just going to skip this slide here. I'm going to talk about the enteric methane examples that a lot of producers are probably familiar with, at least to some degree recently. But I think the biggest questions are about what is the intervention to achieve the enteric methane reductions going to be? Is it going to be, and if it's going to be a feed additive, what are the implications for the producer on feeding that given additive to their cows? So, Asparagopsis is a seaweed product that has been shown to reduce methane emissions 90%, but also leads to the production of bromoform, which is toxic. And so there have been that the opportunity, just I bring that up as one example about needing to be careful about which feed additives you choose, make sure they are well vetted, because the science is evolving on all of them. And yeah. Then talking more about enteric methane, these are the two probably leading programs for creating enteric methane insets. Vera is one of the registries that has this VM41 methodology, and these are some of the firms who have used it. And really, this is a methodology that anybody with a feed additive to reduce enteric methane can use as long as they can comply with the methodology. And you can create offsets through it. You can create inset scope 3 interventions. The methodology is public. And so even if you're doing it through a non-Vera registry, you can even if you're doing it not through Vera, you can use their methodology in other registries. SustainCert is example, Reseeds another example. Excuse me, didn't mean to do that. The other one is Athian, who has a strong relationship with Elanco and the Rumens and Elanco's Rumensin and Bovaer products. But Athian, I don't know why this keeps skipping ahead here. Sorry. Athian also recently released another for iGPro L, another enteric methane reduction opportunity. And Athian is a registry, and they've set out to be the livestock carbon marketplace as well. So their goal is to be an exchange. So the credits can get sold through them as well. And those are just two of the leading programs creating enteric methane credits. I want to talk a little bit more about the alternative manure management project examples, but this is going to typically be a lot more like getting involved in a digester project where there's going to be some significant infrastructure installed on a farm, whether that be anything from screw press separators to advanced nutrient recovery. And so you have to think about the capital costs. You have to think about the partnership of who's going to develop, own, and operate that system and run those sophisticated technologies. If it's just screw press separators, typically farms can do that themselves and the costs are not as great. But yeah, lots of operational questions to think about here. In addition, digester projects and AMP projects typically the accounting can be done at an individual farm level reasonably well. And there's enough emissions reductions that can make it worthwhile for individual farms as long as they're large enough to do one of these projects on their own. Whereas the regenerative ag projects and the enteric methane projects, typically those are what we call aggregated projects where many producers would be participating in a program that one organization has developed. So the regenerative ag projects, typically, if you only have less than one ton of emissions reductions per acre, like a tenth of a metric ton per acre, you need hundreds of thousands of acres to make those projects economically viable. And that's why typically you might have a program that farms can sign up to participate in, but they have to follow the rules of, and somebody else manages the whole program and the accounting for the whole program and all the fields from all the farms that are involved. So I think just to try and wrap up here, what does all this mean for you, the producers? Is this all good for dairy farms in general? I think the answer is yes. But as there will be reduced barriers to entry, more opportunities for a lot of the interventions align with efficiency of operations and efficiency of production. But as long as it doesn't just end up being mandates for farms to reduce emissions and more cost. And as I mentioned before, it may be obvious to align with your coil pump processor, but if they don't have something that works well for you, then what can you do? And working with trusted advisors, nutritionists, consultants, as well as farms who you are aligned with, whether they be neighbors or somebody in a watershed group, can help you together achieve economies of scale and efficiency that can open up some doors. And I think the big takeaway message, especially related to double counting, is to always be really careful of your contracts and commitments and what you have signed and committed to do. So you're not getting yourself in a sticky situation between two entities with conflicting priorities. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All good things. And again, Patrick, thank you for joining us today. So for those that were listening only, I encourage you to go back and look at the video portion of it too, because I think there's a lot of slides that'll be crucial that you might want to screenshot or just kind of reference back to just from viable resources, and let alone Patrick to go back and reach out to. But I think the biggest thing that stood out, at least for me, as far as an actionable, something you can walk away with, is really lean on your network. Lean on your management team, whether it's your veterinarian, your nutritionist, that counsel around you, to think of out of the box, think creatively of what you can do to either enhance projects that you already have going on, or if you're still sitting on that fence and figuring out what you could do, talk to them. And if you're still kicking the tires at it, I hope you got friends, let alone across the fence, but maybe across some state lines, to just see what they're doing and lean out and reach out to see what else, because there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of potential out there. So to keep that ball moving, keep the momentum moving forward. So again, Patrick, thank you for joining us today, and again, being a great friend of PDPW, but sharing your time, sharing your insight here today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And again, a special thank you to our national sponsors that help make the Dairy Signal possible. You're going to see a slight shift moving forward, moving into this summer here. We're going to be still executing live. We'll still be coming to you with cutting edge topics, but we're going to be executing every Tuesday and Thursday. So we're going to give your brain a slight break on those Wednesdays. But I also, and this topic of here into what Patrick was driving in, is you really can't manage what you don't know. So kind of helping yourself get that baseline, figure out where you're at. I know there are programs that are out there that still exist. There are still resources out there, regardless if you need to put a little skin in the game or if they're going to help you pro bono. There are still entities out there that are available. Quick shout out, I feel like it's a shameless plug, but it's an important one, is that Professional Dairy Producers does have one that will help you get that baseline, help you know where you're starting at, so you can better manage where you're at today. And it's called Your Farm, Your Footprint. So if you're at all curious how that works, what would go into it, by all means, give us a call here at the office, or check us out online. It's at pdpw.org. It's right there on top. Click on it and it'll walk you through. There are now 2 steps or 2 phases into that. So you have to go through phase 1, but there is a next step. if you're in that Nestle milk shed, as Patrick was talking and explaining what those milk sheds mean. So again, check it out if you're at all curious. I think it's a great tool to keep us moving forward. Without further ado, everyone, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again this Thursday. Take care in the meantime.